Okay, I'm not sure why I'm struggling so much this morning, but this is literally the fifth time that I've recorded this lecture. um, so hopefully the fifth time will be the charm. I wanted to start by letting you guys know that I already posted a lecture to the lymphatics module, and so this should be the second lecture of the day that you've watched, the first one being the final presentation of the lymphatics module. Okay, so endocrine system should be a review for almost everybody, being that we talked about it last semester. But before we jump too far in, I just want to do a sort of a general overview of the different means that our body uses to communicate from cell to cell. And so many of these, or most of these, with the exception of maybe the paracrines, should be a review for you guys. So we'll start with gap junctions. This is sort of an incomplete image in that there should be sort of a cell here and a cell here that you can use your imagination for. And then we have these gap junctions, which are these pores in the plasma membrane between these two adjacent cells. And what they do is they not only join the cells together, but they also allow this passageway for different nutrients, electrolytes, signaling molecules. So we talked about these when we were learning about the heart. Okay, so this is how cardiomyocytes send ions back and forth to excite each other. Neurotransmitters should also be something that's very familiar to all of you. They're the little chemicals that we release at the synaptic cleft of a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. So we get a presynaptic neuron with some electrical excitation that passes down the axon, and then once it reaches this point, in order to signal that postsynaptic neuron, we need to send neurotransmitters or chemicals across the synaptic cleft. So they're released through these vesicles that are in the axon terminal of this presynaptic neuron, and then they'll excite this guy once they cross the synaptic cleft. Paracrines and hormones are very similar. We have an illustration here. Here on this side we have paracrines, and here on this side we have hormones. So paracrines act very similarly to hormones, but they have a more local effect, which is why they're also known as local hormones. Okay, so you have a secreting cell that's going to secrete these paracrines or chemicals that are going to be received by their responding cell, but that responding cell is going to be very nearby within the same tissue, where hormones, on the other hand, are secreted from this secreting cell. They enter into the blood vessels, and then they're going to travel or be transported to more distant locations where they'll be received by a responding cell. Okay, so very similar. These just have more local effects, and these can be transported through the blood to have more distant effects. All right, so the endocrine system, again, is just the hormones, tissues, and cells within your body that produce hormones. So here we have some glands that everybody should be somewhat familiar with from last semester, but we will talk about them in more depth as we move through this chapter. This is just sort of a side note. We're not going to spend much more time talking about this, but I just wanted you guys to be aware of the fact that we can have hormonal secretions from organs and tissues that aren't necessarily thought of as glands. So here we have the brain, the heart, the small intestine, the bones, and the adipose tissue. Those are all capable of secreting hormones, but again are not endocrine glands. Okay, so by now everybody should be aware of the fact that we have an exocrine and an endocrine system, and the two are distinguishable from each other because, firstly, the exocrine glands secrete or release non-hormonal secretions. So what that is it's going to be things like sweat, like oils, like milk, like digestive juices, all of those sort of things, tears, and so those secretions are going to be released through ducts. Okay, that's the second way that we distinguish between each of these systems. So we can see here we have a mammary gland that's producing milk and releasing that milk through ducts. And then the third way to distinguish is that it's released into some sort of epithelial surface. So in here we have the surface of the skin, and here we have the surface of the mucosa lining the small intestine. Okay, so we say that it's released into some external environment. That doesn't always necessarily mean the surface of the skin. It just means that it's not released into the blood. Because endocrine glands, on the other hand, they release hormones only. So they're only releasing hormones, and those hormones are going into the internal environment, so directly into the bloodstream. What that means is we don't have ducts, and it's not going to some epithelial surface. It's going right into the bloodstream where it's going to travel to its target cells, which is what you see in this picture. Okay, so exocrine, non-hormonal secretions like milk or tears, they're secreted through ducts, and they're secreted to some type of epithelial surface, which can be like the digestive tract. Endocrine glands only secrete hormones. They're secreted directly into the bloodstream, so they don't use ducts, and they're secreted to the internal environment, which just means the bloodstream. Okay, so some exocrine glands, some of these we've already talked about. We have sebaceous glands right here. They also produce oils that'll be released through this duct here. Sweat glands will produce sweat, which are released to these ducts and to the surface of the skin. Mammary gland we already talked about. Salivary glands, you can see we have the gland here. It's going to produce saliva, which will be released through this duct into the mucosa that lines the mouth. Lacrimal glands produce tears, and you can see the ducts here. And then gonads and pancreas are down here at the bottom in red because they are mixed glands. And what that means is they have both endocrine and exocrine function. Okay, so here we have the gonads, and you can see all of these ducts. Their exocrine function is sperm production. Okay, so the sperm's going to be produced in here. It'll travel through all of these ducts until it's ejected through the penis. And so that's its exocrine function. But the testes are also responsible for the production of testosterone. So that's its endocrine function. And the pancreas, which we talked about its exocrine function here, right? It produces these pancreatic juices or digestive juices that are secreted into the small intestine. But its endocrine function is equally as important in that it produces really essential hormones like insulin. Okay, so these guys are down in red here at the bottom because they're mixed glands. Ovaries, I can't remember if I touched on those yet. Their exocrine function is that they produce eggs, and their endocrine function is that they produce hormones like progesterone and estrogen and those types of sex hormones. Endocrine glands, we're going to talk about these in more depth as we move through, but the thyroid gland is in the throat area here in both the cat and the biped or the human. The parathyroid gland sits right on top of that. So here you have the parathyroid glands here. Hypothalamus is in the brain, so right here. The pituitary gland sits right beneath that. The adrenal gland sits right on top of the kidneys here. Right here and right here. The pineal gland is right here in the brain. The thymus is right above the heart. I don't know why I could not find a picture of the thymus included in the endocrine glands in quadrupeds, but it's right above the heart. And then, of course, gonads and pancreas. Gonads are right here. So ovaries in the female, testes in the male, and then ovaries in the female, testes in the male down here. And then the pancreas is right here and right here in this sort of yellow creamy color. Okay, so now we're going to spend some time comparing the endocrine system and the nervous system. And the reason we want to make this comparison is because both of these systems function in communication. So one of these systems is not only going to complement the other, but they'll also regulate the other. And so what I mean by that is we have some neurons in our body that are going to target a gland, an endocrine gland, and in response that endocrine gland will release hormones. Okay, so some neurons trigger the secretion of hormones. On the flip side of that, we also have hormones in our body that will either trigger or inhibit some neurons. Okay, so both of these systems serve in communication. They both use chemicals to communicate, right? We talked about neurotransmitters here. Once this signal gets to the end of the neuron, it's got to release these neurotransmitters to target whatever cells, or maybe we have another neuron here. Okay, so that's a form of chemical use in order to communicate, but the endocrine system also does that, right? So we have these endocrine cells that are part of a gland. They're releasing these hormones, which are going to travel through the bloodstream to target these cells and communicate. Okay, and we even have some chemicals that act both as part of the nervous system as neurotransmitters and also as hormones. So norepinephrine is a hormone that also acts as a neurotransmitter. Dopamine is another one, and ADH, which we'll talk about more as we move through. So neuroendocrine cells are something that are really actually pretty interesting and cool, and they are super important for you guys to understand. So they act like neurons, but they are also responsible for the secretion of hormonal products into the bloodstream. So here we have in this diagram a normal neuron, and it's targeting this neuroendocrine cell. So this neuroendocrine cell, what it does is it produces a hormone, let's say up here in the soma. That hormone will travel down the axon, and it's going to wait at the axon terminal until this same neuroendocrine cell receives some sort of action potential. So it'll be excited, have some electrical excitation that travels down the axon. Once that excitation gets down to the terminal, these hormones will be signaled to be released into the bloodstream. Okay, so neuroendocrine cells, they are neurons, but they also produce and release hormones. Okay, so contrasting the endocrine and the nervous system, we talked about this difference already, right? The endocrine system communicates through the use of hormones, and the nervous system communicates through the use of electrical impulses and then neurotransmitters. Some differences between them that we haven't touched on yet. The endocrine system basically, because it uses hormones, hormones can generate a response seconds to days after they're released. Okay, while the nervous system, on the other hand, responds much more quickly. So when your nervous system receives some sort of stimulus, it's going to create a response within milliseconds. All right, so really fast. The endocrine system, hormones will generate a response sometimes seconds after they're released, or sometimes days after they're released. So it's much slower response. Another difference between the two is that the effects of hormones can last for a really long time. They can last for days or much longer. With the nervous system, after a stimulus stops, the nervous system stops responding almost immediately. So let's say you walk into I don't know, a boys' locker room, and it's really stinky in there, and you're like, oh my god, I can't walk through this door, this is horrible. So you walk out, you're not really smelling that odor anymore, okay? So as soon as the stimulus stops with the nervous system, it'll pretty much stop responding immediately, whereas with the endocrine system, hormonal effects can last much longer. Another difference that we sort of already touched on when we talked about the nervous system is that during long-term stimulation, a lot of neurons will quickly adapt and that response will decline. So again, using the locker room example, if you chose not to walk out of the locker room, your nose would eventually adjust to the smell and maybe you wouldn't be able to smell it as strongly. Or if you get into a really hot tub, it's really hot at first, but eventually your neurons will adapt and that stimulus or response sort of declines. That's not true for the endocrine system. With the endocrine system, you get more long-term stimulation, and so whatever your response is tends to be more persistent. And then the last difference that we haven't touched on yet is that the endocrine system provides sort of more general or widespread effects. And we'll talk about this as we talk about growth hormone. You'll see that because some of these hormones circulate through the entire body, they're able to target more space than is true for a single nerve. Right, we have a spinal nerve that leaves the spinal cord and it's going to arrive to some target organ, and then we have a nerve fiber within that nerve that's going to target one specific limited number of cells within that organ. And so in that way, the nervous system has a much more specific or local effect as compared to the endocrine system, where we have hormones like growth hormone that are circulating and can target a whole bunch of tissues like muscles, bones, and the liver, as we'll see as we talk about growth hormone. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, well, if growth hormone can circulate and target all of these different organs, how is it we can have so many hormones circulating all at the same time that, aren't targeting all of these organs? That seems like it would be pretty chaotic. And the way that we regulate how our hormones affect or don't affect a certain target is that our hormones are only able to act on our target organs or cells that contain those appropriate receptors. Okay, so an example of that, well, let's just take a look at this picture here. We have this secreting cell that's secreting a hormone, and this is not a target cell, so it doesn't have any receptors. This is a target cell, so it does have receptors. Okay, so those hormones can bind to the cells that have receptors, but they're not going to have any effect on a cell like this that doesn't have receptors for it. So an example of that would be thyroid stimulating hormone. It is a hormone that's produced by the pituitary gland. It circulates through our entire body, but it's only going to have an effect on the thyroid gland, and the reason for that is because the thyroid gland is the only one that has these receptors. All the other cells might be exposed to the thyroid stimulating hormone, but they don't have the receptors, so it doesn't really matter. Another way that we can limit the effects of hormones to strictly our target organs is that some target organs have enzymes that can activate these hormones that are otherwise inactive. So testosterone is a great example of that. Testosterone circulates in our body in a pretty much inactive form, and then when it arrives to the testes, or arrives to its from the testes to its target organ, whatever that target organ may be has enzymes that'll convert it to a more active form. Okay, so here's just some hormone nomenclature that I want you guys to sort of try to familiarize yourself with. The list in your book is much more extensive, but these are the ones that I felt were kind of really important for you guys to know, especially if you're going to be moving on to vet school. You're going to see these a lot, so just try to familiarize with them. Familiarize yourself with them. Okay, so practice questions for this section. What is a hormone? How is it different from a neurotransmitter? How is the endocrine system similar to the nervous system, right? They're both used in communication. They both sort of use the same means of communication, but also they're different in some ways. So how is the nervous system different from the endocrine system? Distinguish between endocrine and exocrine glands, and how is it that hormones circulate through the blood without affecting every single tissue that they come into contact with? Okay, so in order to understand the endocrine system, we really have to have a good understanding of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And the reason for that is because these guys have a lot of regulation over a lot of different endocrine glands in our bodies. Okay, so the hypothalamus regulates a lot of the functions of the brain and then carries out those functions through the endocrine system by the pituitary gland. So here's the hypothalamus. It's like this section up here, or right here. And then the pituitary gland is this little bulb that suspends from the floor of the hypothalamus. And it's roughly the size and shape of a kidney bean in a human being. Okay, so the pituitary gland is broken down into two lobes. We have the anterior lobe, which is sort of like the frontal lobe. I shouldn't say that because then you'll get confused with the frontal lobe of the brain. But anterior, right, means front of the body. So it's going to be the lobe of the pituitary gland that's in the front. And then we have the posterior lobe back here, or the posterior pituitary gland. So the anterior makes up about 75% of the pituitary gland, and it's connected to the hypothalamus through all of these blood vessels that you see. You can see this one has a lot more capillaries and blood vessels compared to the posterior. And the reason for that is because the hypothalamus right here controls this anterior pituitary through hormonal secretions. So if the hypothalamus wants to communicate with this anterior pituitary gland, it's going to send hormones through these blood capillaries. While on the other hand, this posterior pituitary lobe is going to receive communication from this hypothalamus through nerve signals. Okay, so it's really made up of nervous tissue, and in that way it's not really a true gland. But again, if the hypothalamus wants to share information with the posterior pituitary gland, it's going to send it through nerve signals. And it has these neuroendocrine cells that we talked about in the last section that, if you remember, they act just like neurons, but they also produce hormones. Okay, so what happens is they produce hormones up here in the neurosomas, or the cell bodies, and then those hormones are going to travel down the axons into the posterior pituitary lobe. And then once an electrical signal travels down these lobes, the hormones travels down the axons, the hormones will be waiting at the axon terminals. So the electrical signal gets to the bottom of the axon and it causes the posterior pituitary to release those hormones. Okay, so hormones are produced up here in the neuron cell body. They're spread down the axon or transported down the axon into the posterior pituitary and then released upon some electrical excitation from these neurons. Okay, so there are 8 hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. 6 of them are going to regulate the anterior pituitary, and 2 of them are going to be produced by the hypothalamus and then stored and released by the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the 6 that regulate the anterior pituitary are classified as either releasing or stimulating hormones or as inhibiting hormones. So releasing or stimulating hormones are hormones that stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release some kind of hormone. Well, on the other hand, inhibiting hormones are going to inhibit this anterior pituitary gland to release hormones. Okay, so you have hormones produced up here. 6 of them target this anterior pituitary gland. Of those 6, some of them are going to stimulate this gland to release its own hormones, and some of them are going to inhibit this gland to release some of its own hormones. Okay, and then we have 2 hormones that again are stored and released by the posterior pituitary, and those are oxytocin and ADH, which we'll talk about as we move through. So these are the 6 hormones, or actually we have 4 here, but these are the 4 of the 6 that are considered stimulating hormones. Okay, so of those we have growth hormone releasing hormone. So that's a hormone that's going to be produced by the hypothalamus. It's this one here in purple, and it's going to trigger the pituitary gland to release growth hormone. Okay, so hypothalamus produces growth hormone releasing hormone. It arrives to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and as a result, that anterior lobe is going to release growth hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, is here in yellow. So the hypothalamus produces this stimulating or releasing hormone. It targets the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and as a result is going to promote the secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone and prolactin from this anterior lobe. Corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, is in blue right here, comes from the hypothalamus. It's a releasing or stimulating hormone. As a result, it'll target the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and the anterior lobe will produce ACTH. And then finally, gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, which we have here in green, is going to come from the hypothalamus. It's another releasing hormone, so it's going to stimulate the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland to secrete our gonadotropins, which are FSH and LH. So those are going to target the gonads. The inhibiting hormones that come from the hypothalamus are growth hormone inhibiting hormone, otherwise known as somatostatin, or prolactin inhibiting hormone. So in this picture here, I only have an illustration for the growth hormone inhibiting hormone, otherwise known as somatostatin, which you see here. So basically, the hypothalamus releases somatostatin, which targets the anterior pituitary gland and inhibits it from releasing growth hormone. Okay, so you're really looking at this portion of the diagram. So somatostatin is released by the hypothalamus, and it inhibits the pituitary gland from releasing growth hormone. Okay, and the same thing for prolactin. Okay, so the hypothalamus would release prolactin inhibiting hormone, which would target the pituitary gland to stop releasing prolactin. Okay, so if you haven't noticed yet, basically what we get here is this hypothalamic chain reaction, which is otherwise known as an axis. And so the general pattern that you should be noticing at this point is that the hypothalamus is going to secrete some type of hormone, either a stimulating hormone, like we see here, or an inhibitory hormone, okay, like these guys right here. And so let's just use stimulating hormone as an example because that's what we have in this picture. The hypothalamus releases this stimulating hormone. In this case, it's thyrotropin releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, that's going to target the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. In response, the pituitary gland receives this TRH and secretes its own hormone. So in this example, the anterior pituitary gland is going to receive TRH, and in response, it's going to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so then this hormone that's released by the pituitary gland travels through the blood and is going to target some type of endocrine gland. In this example, we have the thyroid gland. And then this thyroid gland, which is targeted by the TSH, will in response secrete the thyroid hormone, which will travel and target its own organs. Okay, so this chain reaction, the hypothalamus secretes a stimulating or releasing hormone that's going to target the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will then release its own hormone, which will target an endocrine gland, and the endocrine gland will release its own hormone, in this case thyroid hormone, which will target or have its own effect. Okay, so this is the hypothalamic chain reaction. So hormones that come from the anterior pituitary gland, these are the ones that we're going to talk about today. We have gonadotropin. So your gonads are your testes and ovaries. So we'll talk about gonadotropins. We'll also talk about thyroid stimulating hormone, which is what you saw in this picture here. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, that's a mouthful. I'm going to give you some nice veterinary examples of how that hormone comes into play. Prolactin, so if you're a dairy student, you have heard all about prolactin. And then growth hormone we'll talk a lot about because it's produced in the greatest numbers. So gonadotropins, again, are produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and they target your gonads. Okay, so gonads. Those are your ovaries and your testes. And the hormones that are considered gonadotropins, so the hormones that target your gonads or your ovaries and testes, are your follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, it's going to stimulate your ovaries or testes to produce sex hormones, so things like estrogen and testosterone. It's also going to stimulate the development of the follicles that you have on your ovaries, and in the testes, it'll stimulate sperm production. So this is actually supposed to be its own bullet. It got sort of jumbled up there. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation, which is when you release an egg from your ovaries, and it also stimulates the corpus luteum, which is basically one of these, after you ovulate or after you release an egg from a follicle, it becomes the corpus luteum, and this corpus luteum secretes progesterone, and it'll keep secreting progesterone all throughout pregnancy. So I'm not sure, I can't remember if you guys did the reproductive chapter last semester, but if you did, then this should be something you're at least somewhat familiar with. And then in the testes, luteinizing hormone stimulates the secretion of testosterone. Okay, so follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are hormones that come from the anterior pituitary gland and target the ovaries and the testes, or your gonads. Thyroid stimulating hormone. I did not mean to put this picture here because we're going to talk about this as we talk about thyroid hormone, but I'll just give you a little rundown of why these pictures are here, and if you took my lab, then you definitely heard this already. So thyroid stimulating hormone is a hormone that's produced by this anterior pituitary gland, and it stimulates the thyroid gland. Okay, so hypothalamus releases TRH, which is its own hormone. It's going to target the anterior pituitary gland. As a result, the anterior pituitary gland will release thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, and so that thyroid stimulating hormone is going to target the thyroid and cause the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone is really important in terms of metabolic rate. That's why I have these two pictures down here. I don't want to get too far ahead or confuse you guys, but basically this kitty has hyperthyroidism, so she's producing too much thyroid hormone, and so she's really skinny and her metabolism is really revving. And this guy here, he doesn't produce enough thyroid hormone, and so his metabolism is really slow, and that is why he's a big fatty boombalatti. So, thyroid stimulating hormone again comes from the anterior pituitary gland and targets the thyroid. As a result, the thyroid produces thyroid hormone, which affects metabolism. Okay? So don't get confused here. I want you to be able to distinguish between thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland, and then thyroid hormone itself comes from the thyroid gland and affects metabolic rate. Okay, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is another hormone that's produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and it functions to target the adrenal glands. So here's the kidneys down here. The adrenal glands sit right above them, and the adrenal glands produce something called glucocorticoids. An example of a single glucocorticoid that you might be familiar with is cortisol. It's called our stress hormone, and glucocorticoids are really important in our body because they regulate the metabolism of these different macronutrients, so glucose, fat, and proteins. Okay, and so what they do specifically is they prepare our body to start burning these fuels instead of storing them. And they're really important, again, in our body's response to stress. So this dog, so let's just look at this here. The hypothalamus secretes some sort of stimulating hormone. In this case, it's CRH, okay, which I think is corticotropic releasing hormone. Targets the pituitary gland, and as a result, the pituitary gland secretes ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, so ACTH comes from the pituitary gland, is going to travel through the blood and target these adrenal glands here. And these adrenal glands are what are responsible for the secretion of glucocorticoids. Okay, so this dog here has something called Addison's disease. And in Addison's disease, for most of the time unknown reasons, the production of ACTH declines. Okay, so this adrenocorticotropic hormone is really depleted in their circulatory system. And so what that means is the adrenal glands aren't being stimulated adequately. And what that means is we don't get enough glucocorticoids. And so the way that that affects them is they have an inability to regulate the metabolism of these macronutrients. And in that way, maybe the effects that you see are somewhat similar to diabetes, in that people with diabetes have trouble regulating their glucose levels. These guys, similarly but not the same, have difficulty regulating the metabolism of glucose or these different sources of energy. And so they might become really listless, they might lose a lot of weight. And on the other hand, we have Cushing's disease, which the telltale signs are usually hair loss like this, and then see how she has this really cute pot belly. So, or it's actually Cushing's syndrome. So Cushing's syndrome happens when she produces too much ACTH. So maybe she has a benign tumor of her pituitary glands. Now she's producing way too much ACTH, and as a result, that adrenocorticotropic hormone is targeting this adrenal gland and stimulating it way too much. Now she's producing way too much of the glucocorticoids, okay? And that also can have negative effects in terms of the metabolism of these macromolecules or nutrients that she has coming in. So a lot of times what we see with these guys is they have this insatiable appetite, not very different from kitties that are hyperthyroid or have too much thyroid hormone. And that's a direct effect of these increased cortisol levels. Okay, prolactin is another hormone that's produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and it stimulates the mammary gland to begin milk production. So when women are pregnant, their bodies start producing a lot more prolactin, but it doesn't really have any effect until after the woman gives birth, at which time milk synthesis occurs. Okay, so in this picture, what we see here is a woman has a baby suckling. That suckling, and sometimes even a baby crying, can have the same effect. It'll send a nerve impulse to the brain. She gets this nerve impulse in her brain, and as a result, the hypothalamus sends hormones, in this case, thyrotropin releasing hormone, so a stimulating hormone, down these blood vessels to the anterior pituitary gland. And as a result, the anterior pituitary secretes prolactin, which travels through the blood back to the mammary gland and allows her to start producing milk. Same thing down here. We'll give an animal example with a dairy cow. The farmer here is going to stimulate the cow's teats by doing something we call stripping the milk. So what that means is he's going to just take the first small portion of milk out of the ducts there. Because it has a high bacterial count. When he does that and he first touches the teat, she's going to be stimulated. So that sends a nerve impulse up to her brain. Once it arrives there, the hypothalamus will, in response, produce oxytocin. Okay, so this cell here is going to start producing oxytocin and send it down here into the posterior pituitary. And also, the hypothalamus is going to be stimulated to release thyrotropin releasing hormone. That travels through the blood to the anterior pituitary gland, and as a result, we get release of prolactin. That prolactin travels in conjunction with the oxytocin back down through the blood to the mammary gland, and the mammary gland is stimulated for milk letdown. So this picture here just shows you this is the endocrine portion where we get this production of these hormones. The exocrine function is the actual release of the milk. This is the non-hormonal secretion that's traveling to an epithelial surface, whereas this is the hormonal secretion that enters right into the bloodstream. Okay, so prolactin, again, produced by the anterior pituitary gland and stimulates the mammary gland to begin milk production. Growth hormone, so we're going to talk a lot more about this at the end of the presentation today, but growth hormone is really important in that it's the hormone that's produced in the greatest quantity by the pituitary gland. So again, this is just sort of a quick overview, but we will get into this in a little bit more depth later on. So growth hormone is otherwise called somatotropin, and it's again produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and as I've said, the anterior pituitary gland produces at least 1,000 times as much growth hormone compared to any other hormone that it produces. Okay, and it's responsible for stimulating mitosis or cellular division in order to help our tissues in maybe our muscles or our bones grow throughout our body. Okay, so those are our anterior pituitary hormones. Because we only have 2 of the posterior pituitary hormones, I put them both on the same slide. So we're going to start by talking about oxytocin, and I know we did that already over here when we talked about prolactin comes from the anterior pituitary, oxytocin comes from the posterior pituitary. But, so we talked about its involvement in the flow of milk from the mammary gland. And again, on this slide, I just want to reiterate the oxytocin is produced up here in the cell body of this neuron. It travels down this neuroendocrine cell to the posterior pituitary gland, and it's going to stay here until we get some sort of electrical conduction that travels down this axon and signals this posterior pituitary gland to release the hormone. Okay, so again, it's not exactly a true endocrine gland in the fact that it's controlled through the hypothalamus through nervous tissue, as opposed to the anterior, which is controlled by the hypothalamus through these blood vessels. Okay, so another thing that oxytocin does is it's involved in contraction, so muscle contraction. So in the case of lactation, prolactin is here what's responsible for milk production. Oxytocin is what's responsible for the cells of the mammary gland contracting to release the milk. Okay, so in that same way, oxytocin surges in both sexes during sexual arousal. Okay, so it aids in the propulsion of sperm through the male reproductive tract, and on that same note, helps the uterus to contract in order to transport the sperm up the female reproductive tract. All right, and then the last thing it does, and we'll talk more about this because we're going to talk about feedback loops, but basically, oxytocin also stimulates labor contraction and childbirth. Okay, so here in this diagram, we have a baby that pushes against the reproductive tract. It causes the reproductive tract to stretch. That stretching sends a nerve impulse to the brain. In response to that nerve impulse, the brain stimulates the posterior pituitary gland to release oxytocin, and then that oxytocin travels through the blood back to the uterine lining, causing the uterine lining to contract. That pushes the baby farther down the tract, and again starts this whole process over again. We get more stretching, more nerve signals, more stimulation of the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin, and then again that oxytocin travels back to the uterus for more contraction. And this happens over and over again until the baby's born. But again, we'll talk about that when we talk about positive feedback loops. And then the second posterior pituitary hormone is that we're going to talk about is ADH. So ADH is responsible for increasing water retention in your kidneys. So we haven't talked about the urinary system yet, but once we get there, you'll realize that the kidneys play a key role in producing urine. And so when we're dehydrated, what ADH does is it's a hormone that reduces our urine output. So it helps us from becoming dehydrated, and it does that through having our kidneys retain more water. Okay, so this is a video that I have, and it basically, I don't know if you were in my labs, you may have seen it or may have not seen it, but it's a video of a guy who's basically stuck on a raft out at sea, and he is really dehydrated, and so it just shows the effect of ADH. I think you'll probably have to watch this in your own PowerPoint presentations, but the link should work there. Okay, so neuroendocrine reflexes. We actually have talked about these a lot already, but maybe haven't quite defined them. But this is basically when you get a release of hormones in response to nerve signals. So this is how your posterior pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. So we've talked about that a lot already today. You get these axons here that control this posterior pituitary gland, as opposed to the blood vessels here that are releasing hormones to control the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so the example that we did talk about already was like an infant suckling. Okay, so the infant suckling sends a nerve impulse to the brain, or maybe the infant's crying. In the case of dairy animals, sometimes they hear the feed truck coming and they'll start to lactate already because they know that it's time to go to the milking parlor. And so what happens is it sends this nerve impulse to the brain, and the hypothalamus sends a nerve signal to the posterior pituitary gland, which then releases oxytocin. Okay, so we get a hormone produced up here, travels down this axon, and it's going to wait down here. That oxytocin will wait down here until we get a nerve signal that also travels down here. So some electrical excitation that travels down here and says, okay, release the oxytocin. Okay, so that's the release of a hormone in response to a nerve signal. Okay, so that is how our hypothalamus controls the posterior pituitary gland for the release of not only oxytocin, right, but also ADH, which also comes from this gland. Okay, so now we're going to talk about feedback loops, starting with negative feedback inhibition. And this is basically just a way that our downstream organs, like the testicles, can moderate or regulate the activity of these upstream organs like the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So not only do the hypothalamus and pituitary gland control all of these downstream organs, but these glands, these downstream glands also have some influence on these hypothalamus and pituitary glands. Okay, so in general, what happens with this process is that the hypothalamus is going to secrete some sort of excitatory or stimulating or releasing hormone, or an inhibitory hormone. In this case, it's a stimulating hormone. So the stimulating hormone is released to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland releases its own hormones. So in this case, it's gonadotropins. So it's releasing FSH and LH. That's going to target the testicles so that they start producing testosterone. But once we get enough testosterone in the body, it's going to come back, circle back to both the pituitary and the hypothalamus and say, okay, stop releasing GnRH, stop releasing the gonadotropins. Okay, so the pituitary releases some stimulating hormone. Let's just call it hormone A. In this case, it's A1 and A2. And then they're going to target some downstream gland, which will release hormone B, in this case testosterone. Hormone B travels back to the pituitary gland and also to the hypothalamus to stop the secretion of hormone A. So we just looked at an example with testosterone. This is another example with thyroid hormone, but same exact thing. So again, the hypothalamus secretes thyrotropin releasing hormone. That's an excitatory or stimulating hormone that's going to target the pituitary gland. In response, the pituitary gland is going to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone. That thyroid stimulating hormone is going to target the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland then releases thyroid hormone, which not only has its effects on metabolism, but also circulates back to target the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland and say, stop producing TRH, stop producing TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so that's negative feedback inhibition. Positive feedback loops are the same but opposite. So this is how our downstream organs regulate the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to get them to continue secretion. Okay, so the example that we already talked about was labor contractions. So what happens is during labor, again, the uterine or the uterus is going to stretch. Okay, and that stretching sends nerve signals up to the brain. As a result, once it gets to the brain, the posterior pituitary gland will secrete oxytocin. So the hypothalamus produces the oxytocin and then sends it through that neuroendocrine gland to the posterior lobe. From there, the posterior pituitary gland will secrete its oxytocin. The oxytocin travels through the blood back to the uterus. And as a result, the uterus contracts again and pushes the baby farther down the reproductive tract. That creates more stretching lower in the reproductive tract, and the whole thing happens over and over again until the baby's born. Okay, so that's positive feedback loops. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to talk about is just a little bit more about growth hormone, because again, it is the hormone that's produced in the greatest quantity by the pituitary gland. Specifically produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and it's different from other hormones in that it has more widespread effects. So we talked about how these hormones are able to target their organs through specific receptors. The growth hormone has target organs that have receptors on more organs throughout the body. So that could be the muscle, could be the bone, and it also targets the liver. And its effect on the liver is that it produces something called IGF-1, or actually IGF-2 as well. So we'll talk about those as we move through. Okay, so important mechanisms of insulin-like growth factor and growth hormone. The first is that it's involved in protein synthesis. So it does this through boosting the production of RNA. It also does this by helping our cells take in more amino acids so that they can be used as building blocks for protein. And it also does this by suppressing protein catabolism, so the breakdown of protein. Okay, so we're taking more amino acids into the cells so that we can build more proteins, and we're also stopping protein breakdown from happening. It has the opposite effect on lipids. So with lipid metabolism, it stimulates the fat cells to break down so that they'll release these fatty acids and glycerols that we can use for energy. And by freeing up this type of energy, we're then able to spare those protein molecules that we're trying to build. It has a similar effect on carbohydrates as it does on protein. So we want to spare carbohydrates, and we do that by freeing up these fat cells, or freeing up energy from fat cells. So we stimulate fat catabolism and therefore spare glucose. And this is really important because the brain depends on glucose. And so by sparing glucose, it can be utilized by the brain, and instead the other tissues can use lipids for their energy source. The other thing it does is stimulate glucose synthesis in the liver. So we're going to create more carbohydrates by stimulating glucose in the liver. And then the last thing it does is it's involved in electrolyte balance. And so what that means is it's going to promote your kidneys to retain electrolytes, and also promote your intestines to take up more electrolytes so that your cells can use them to help grow their tissues. So in childhood, insulin-like growth factor accelerates bone growth at what we call the epiphyseal plate. So you guys should remember this from the skeletal section that we did at the beginning of last semester, that your epiphyseal plate is the site of bone growth. So that's this plate sort of between the head and the neck of the bone, and that's where you get growth. And then in adulthood, insulin-like growth factor stimulates your bones to thicken and remodel. But it is important to note that growth hormone declines with age. So that's why elderly people have much less bone mass compared to young people. They also have much less muscle mass, and they have a greater body fat percentage. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to talk about for the effects of growth hormone are their response to ghrelin. So ghrelin is a hormone that's secreted by the stomach when you are hungry, and it targets your hypothalamus. So here we have ghrelin produced by the stomach. It's going to target the hypothalamus up here. As a result, the hypothalamus will release growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, so here we have the hypothalamus blown up. It releases its stimulating hormone to target the pituitary gland. As a result of this growth hormone releasing hormone, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland will secrete growth hormone, and that's going to circulate throughout the body and target different organs. So we talked about it's going to target the liver to produce insulin-like growth factor. It's going to target the muscles to stimulate protein synthesis. It's going to target the bones and adipose tissues to break down fat. Okay, so growth hormone circulates throughout the body to prime its target organs to take advantage of these anticipated incoming nutrients. Because the stomach's hungry, it sends ghrelin, and then in response we get growth hormone, which says to all these target organs, hey, we're hungry, we're about to eat, prepare yourselves to take advantage of these incoming nutrients. Okay, so practice questions for this section. Distinguish between the anterior and the posterior glands. We talked about how they receive communication and commands from the hypothalamus, right? The anterior pituitary gland is going to receive communication through hormones. The posterior pituitary gland is going to receive communication through nerve signals. And also, the hormones that come from the anterior pituitary gland are produced by the anterior pituitary gland. The hormones that come from the posterior pituitary gland, which is made up of nerve tissue, don't actually come from the posterior pituitary gland. They come from the hypothalamus, right? And the hypothalamus has those really important neuroendocrine cells that are going to produce a hormone and then send it down the axon, where it'll wait until it receives some sort of electrical excitation to be released. What are the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and what are their functions? So we talked about all of those ones that I want you guys to know. Which organs are targeted by hormones that come from the anterior pituitary gland? So we talked about things like thyroid stimulating hormones, so that obviously targets the thyroid. We talked about gonadotropin, so make sure that you understand which not only which hormones are produced by the anterior pituitary, but which glands are targeted by the hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. Which of these hormones have reproductive functions and which ones do not, right? So we talked about gonadotropins and other ones that have effects on the reproductive system. or reproductive organs. Besides the hypothalamus, how is the pituitary gland regulated? Okay, so we talked about positive and negative feedback loops. Give me some examples of negative feedback loops. Give me some examples of positive feedback loops to help supplement your explanation. The liver does not secrete growth hormone, but does support its action. How does it do this? And we talked about insulin-like growth factor that comes from the liver. What does insulin-like growth factor do? What effects does growth hormone have on the metabolism of fats, proteins, and carbs? So we're going to spare proteins, right? Because we want to build proteins. That's the sort of the function of growth hormone. We also want to spare carbohydrates so that they can be utilized by the brain, but we're not going to have that same effect on fats because we want to utilize these fats for energy. Okay, so talk about the effect of growth hormone on all of these different macromolecules. All right, that's it for today. So if you guys have any questions, you can feel free to email me or request a Zoom and we can talk about it. I know the hormones can be kind of tricky, so please reach out with any questions.